Hello, my name is Patrick Kelley, and I'm the senior pastor of River Point Church in Southwest Houston. And I want to talk about the culture clash of marijuana use. That's right, I consider myself an expert because in high school they called me Doobie Lips because of the amount of weed I consumed. I recently had a great experience with how believers, followers of Christ, clash with a culture that embraces marijuana use. During a trip to the Bay Area, we decided to go see the Avett Brothers at the famous Greek Theater on the campus of UC Berkeley. It was general admission event, and me and my wife Lisa and this other couple that we were with were able to get some great seats down in the pit by the stage. It was amazing, although packed with humanity, and as I surveyed the crowd, which I knew I was quite a bit older then, I realized that somehow we were right in the middle of a large group of lesbians who had come to see the opening act, Brandi Carlile. Well, being crazy hungry as I always am, the men decided to leave these two ladies to hold our seats while we went to wait in line for nachos. Well, we waited and waited, and after about 30 minutes of waiting in line, Lisa called me on the phone, and she said very matter-of-factly, she said this, she said, listen, we are abandoning these seats and we are moving up. And I said, what? You got to be crazy. These are great seats. Why? Well, with a mix of frustration and fear, she said that the group of lesbians had become hostile because a straight guy kicked over their beer, which somehow incited the lesbians as they began to talk about how they hated straight people because they were so clumsy. I've never connected being straight with being clumsy, but now everything in my life makes sense. I tried to convince my wife to hold her ground, and try to blend in some way. But because those seats were great, but she moved away anyway. Well, 20 minutes went by, I finally got my nachos, and I headed up to find the new seats, up, 20 rows up. This amazingly steep amphitheater where you feel like you're sitting on the shoulders of the guy in front of you. And I sat down and the opening act started and 8,500 people went crazy. By the time the Avett Brothers took the stage, every single person surrounding our foursome was smoking marijuana. And because the seating was so steep, I could see right over the shoulder of the guy 2 rows up who had a joint so thick it looked like a white cigar. And there we were, right in the middle of this deal, and something about it just energized me. Now, Lisa was nervous and sad, and I can see why, because all 4 of our children have struggled with marijuana use, and we've had to parent through some very destructive behaviors. My sadness, though, was interrupted when I noticed the girl over my shoulder, slightly up, reaching down for an empty clear plastic cup, and she began to throw up in the cup. Well, after about 2 heave-hoes, I leaned over to warn Lisa that the girl directly behind her was throwing up in a cup, and when I completed my sentence of calm but very clear warning, I heard the cup drop to the concrete right behind Lisa, and all of its contents spilled out on her. What a great picture. A picture of what God has called us to. Broken, messy, intoxicated humanity. Light in a dark world. This is the culture Jesus walked into, and the architecture of the Greek theater was quick to remind me that the things weren't really that much different 2,000 years ago. Jesus walked into a pagan culture with destructive laws and customs, but he had a heart to redeem the people. So, how does marijuana use make you feel? My advice is to avoid the temptation of seeing this as a cultural, legal, or even a moral issue of which the church that you lead should take a stand for or against, right? You may be bold. You may make a bold stand for Jesus and fight against the evils of marijuana use, but your mission to reach others will be compromised with this strategy. I just finished a study on the book of Daniel, and I was reminded that a believer can be faithful and effective in a pagan culture without reforming or changing that culture at all. This isn't an intellectual issue that requires your persuasive speech on the decline of America or how God needs to apologize to some Old Testament group if he doesn't bring judgment on our country for the choices that we are making. I'm not told to redeem our culture, but to reach the people in our culture, no matter what its ills or laws are that exist in the culture. Here's my advice. Look at this as a spiritual issue and yet another obstacle and stumbling block for people in the pursuit of God. Our influence in this culture comes from loving people unconditionally who get high. It's not from being some moral dividing rod. We have the onus to coexist in a pagan culture and be effective in reaching others in the name of Christ within that culture. The reality is you already have people in your church that regularly use marijuana, and you're going to have more. In spite of that, can you lead the charge for people to be so compelled by the love of Christ that they surrender all parts of their life to Him, especially the parts of their life that they have to medicate? I loved being at the Greek Theater that night. It reminded me of why I love leading God's church. Being a former pothead myself, I'm grateful that the guy that told me about Jesus Christ didn't make my marijuana use an issue, but allowed me to deal with the bigger sin issue of my life so I could realize my need for a Savior. As for me and my church, we're going to love people where they are and live out a compelling evidence that the love of Christ is better than a temporary moments of pleasure. Now, here's a side note. When Brandi Carlile was finishing her set, and she was amazing, by the way, she announced to the audience that she and her new wife had just had a baby girl together that they named Evangeline. She added this commentary. That's right, Evangeline. That's what we named our little girl. We're taking the good news back from the evangelicals. I have no idea what she meant by that, but it seemed that all 8,500 people cheered.